So I'm going to talk about Magnolia and media, obviously, as it says on the slide. My name is Adriaan Bloem. I work for MBC Group. And before I actually get into this presentation, I'm always trying to sort of understand what my audience is like. And I'm using 2 slides to calibrate on what the audience is like, just to see the reactions. So, for the first one, if everybody could just read this, and then if anybody who would absolutely quit his job if this were their boss, would raise their hand, please. Just read it, and if you think this is something you could live with in your job, then it's fine. But if you think this would make you hate your job, let me know. Yes, of course. Okay. And the other one is completely different. Cyanide and happiness. Just read it for a second. And let me know. Just raise your hand if you think it's even slightly funny. Yeah, okay. Right. That gives me a sort of an idea of what people I'm dealing with as well. The difficult thing for me is always that I find both things interesting and funny, but sort of in between-ish. So to get back to why I'm actually going to talk here, MBC. MBC Group is a broadcaster in the Middle East. It was founded originally in London in 1991. And it's mostly covering Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, but we have a large audience in all of the Arabic countries. It's in fact the largest broadcasting company in the Middle East, and depending on who you ask and when exactly, it's about 165 million viewers, which means it's audience-wise about as big as some of the large American channels. We have, of course, not just one channel, but by now about 10. I think soon it will be 11 and 12. We have a couple of radio stations. And of course the reason I'm here is we have a very large online presence and we have a lot of mobile applications as well. Just the different channels we have, these are the channels we have on our mobile app. These are just some of the different channels we have. So if we have MBC One, which you actually can get on cable in Europe as well. But we also have an action channel. We have MBC3 for kids and a bunch of other things. We also have a news channel, which is Al Arabiya. This is me standing in the studio of Al Arabiya. But just to make it completely clear, the weird thing about how MBC Group is set up is that Al Arabiya is part of us, but it's also very separate. So basically, I'm not talking about Al Arabiya today. If you want to hear more about Al Arabiya, because they're also implementing Magnolia right now, way there in the back, there's Kareem and Aslam. And they are doing Al Arabiya. And I think elsewhere in the audience we have people from T-Next who are working, they're working with them on the implementation. But I'm going to completely ignore this. So, the kind of programs we have on MBC, it's not all guys in white dresses sitting around talking, though we have a lot of that. But we also have various other programs. Guys, what's the name of this program again? I can never pronounce this. So we have a program like this. We also have, for instance, and this is actually the only reason I brought this one up is because it's a show in Arabic that has English subtitles, and you can actually watch it online. It's about 4 guys in their 20s, and they're moving to Dubai and their lives and times. Of course, we have a lot of the regular programming. One of the things I was looking forward to moving to the Middle East was not having to deal with things like idols, which we have, or Got Talent, which we also have. Next month, we're starting The Voice of Arabia. So we have a huge mix of also just Western programming with subtitles. We have formats that everybody else knows, and we have our own shows. And of course, we have so many channels that we have enough time to fill. If I'm looking at online, then we have MBC.net, which is basically an entertainment portal, but it's also home of all of the channels and program microsites. So every program has their own microsites, and all of the channels have their own sites. Then we also have Shahid, which is our video on demand, where you can catch up with shows, you can see all of the episodes of the different shows. And we have a bunch of other things that the list is too long to completely go through this. And we have the World Wrestling Arabia version, we have the Action channel, we have the Shopping channel. We currently have about 9 different mobile applications, which are hugely popular. We recently launched the Shahid mobile application. So this is the video on demand on iPad, and it in the first month and a half got 500,000 downloads. So, and we're now also moving into connected devices, so smart TVs and all of these small cable boxes. The organization of online, we actually have, depending on how you count, between 100 and 140 people working in online across 3 offices. So we have the head offices in Dubai, and we have a large editorial team in Cairo, and most of the development and design is now moving to our office in Jordan, in Amman. If we look at the exact audience of our online, this is taken straight from Google Analytics, so it's a little bit vague. As you can see, the majority is in Saudi Arabia. Then there's a lot of the rest of the Middle East, but surprisingly, it's pretty much the whole world. Everybody who's an Arabic speaker will tune into our websites. So the US, for instance, is a large audience for us, and most European countries are actually high up on the list as well. So if I'm then switching to the actual content management of all of this, you can imagine that with this kind of background, and of course we walk around feeling we are the most important broadcasters in the Middle East. So the previous CMS was chosen based on that kind of thinking, and basically what we ended up with was very similar to something like this. Sort of a stretch Hummer. It's big, it's American, it's luxurious, and it's very expensive. So it must be awesome. And these are the kind of things that are sort of nice to watch from a distance. You don't actually want to drive these to the office every day. So when we started looking at the actual CMS and the issues after a couple of years, you start running into more and more problems. And the system was pretty much unstable, though by the time we started actually replacing it, especially Islam managed to almost get it under control. The implementation from the beginning had been quite chaotic and then redone slightly and was also getting slightly more organized, but was never going to be a very clean implementation. For all of the microsites, for all of these shows, there was a lot of developer involvement for just setting up new structures in the website. So taking too long to actually go live with these microsites, and you have a new program, and typically you will have the people responsible for the program 2 days before tell you, oh, by the way, there's this new program we're going to air tomorrow. Can you do a quick website? So that's a bit of a problem. With that, we also had a lot of maintenance costs just from the software vendor themselves, but also just in getting extra resources. And finding qualified resources for an American CMS in the Middle East was pretty hard. So then looking at the solution for this, obviously at a very high level, is improve the technical side and improve the organization around it. And this is actually where I started getting involved as an outsider. And back then I was still working for CMS Watch, which is now called Real Story Group. And we went through an RFP based on scenarios of what we actually wanted to do online, how editorial has to work with a system and actually the tasks they want to achieve. And based on that, looked at different combinations of vendors and integrators. Sat through hours and hours of demos, and I think this is how we really got to know Pascal very well, because he was the only one that kept us awake for at least 3 hours. In many other cases, that was a challenge. And after going through this list and all of these demos, we decided to do an actual proof of concept with 2 systems and try to put them under load, but also try to implement some of the things we had identified as scenarios. and just see how far you could get with this in 1 month. Of course, we had no illusion that we would do the complete implementation as a proof of concept, but just seeing how it would be to work with these integrators and vendors. So after our Hummer, what we basically ended up with, and trust me that our directors were actually thinking of it in this way, this was the combination we ended up with, and this is how it was thought of. It's like Magnolia is Swiss engineering, it's precision engineered, this is great. And then we get a German company to do the implementation. So that's the best engineering combination you could possibly get. It's one of those things that looks and sounds really nice, but of course the challenge then becomes living up to this. And so far it's actually proven to be quite like this. Some of the reasons why we ended up with Magnolia is, of course, that it's open source, but open source in itself is not a reason to pick something. I mean, I don't really care if it's open source or closed source in itself. That's just a legal thing. But the reason for Magnolia is especially that there's a vibrant community around it, which is, on a day like today, you can tell why we decided that this was a good thing. There's actual documentation and a lot of resources to be found on this. And the nice thing, of course, it's an actual system you can look into the core of the functionalities. You can see the code, you can see how it's been built, you can understand how it's been built, and you can change it. Apart from that, compared to some of the other open source systems, I think Magnolia is quite mature and is using a couple of technologies that in this combination have proven themselves over the past few years. And this was confirmed in our proof of concept. So it was, compared to the other system, the other system was having a very hard time with the task we were setting for it, and just measuring the load on the servers compared to Magnolia was a world of difference. Apart from that, of course, on the scenarios we set, it was a relatively good match. It wasn't perfect, and I think that's sort of the point, because you don't want to go into things thinking they are perfect. Like Dubai is, it's always summer, it's always hot, there's no clouds, there's no rain, but this is the Burj Khalifa with a sandstorm brewing behind it. So if you ignore this, you are really in trouble. And this is actually sort of one of those things where a lot of people, if you've never been to Dubai, you don't really know what it's like. So one of the things that a lot of people are now talking to me about is, have you seen Mission Impossible? And I go, well, yes, but that was completely wrong. Like this kind of sandstorm that you have in Mission Impossible, and you see this wall of sand coming up. We don't have that. We have a lot of dust being kicked up and stuff like that. And Tom Cruise is sitting on the, I think, the 120th floor in a hotel, and the hotel only goes up to the 8th floor. So everything you see in Mission Impossible is wrong. The reality of it is that Dubai is much weirder than Mission Impossible, because what Dubai is, in fact, is something like this. This is me visiting the penguins in Ski Dubai. And it's really nice. These are the king penguins, and you can sit there, you can actually pet them, and they're really nice and soft. I didn't realize that before. It's slightly surreal being in a desert in 50 degrees, walking inside, putting on a coat, and sitting next to the penguins. So anyway, you don't ignore the problems that come with a system. You want to know about these problems before you actually start with it, because then you can anticipate what the problems are. You can start doing things to mitigate the problems, or you can still start building things around it. The main problem for us was not the fact that Arabic is from right to left. This is not what an Arabic website looks like in Arabic. It's not like you simply mirror things. And you actually have a strange mix of things that are still on the right, because everybody's used to seeing these things on the right, whereas you would think if you just mirror it, it would be on the other side. We did have some issues with some of the SDK components not adapting well to the different direction. We spent a couple of weeks getting the sliders to slide in the right direction, for instance. But those issues were actually relatively minor. Getting the Arabic into the system and getting the actual type into the system wasn't the main problem. The main problem actually about Magnolia, and if I'm going to tell you about this, you have to remember that back then Magnolia 5 was sort of like this Fata Morgana in the desert. It's one of those things like, There's the promise it's going to be there, but you don't know how long it's going to take if you're going to start walking. So the sensible thing was not to already start using it as if Magnolia 5 would be the solution to all of the problems. But basically, if you're talking about Magnolia, you're talking about the archetypical classic trees of a website. And you just water that tree and then it grows more leaves, and basically you end up with a bunch of leaves. And they are at a very specific point in the website. So a leaf is always attached to one branch, not to 20, it's attached to one. Whereas the reality of modern websites, of course, is that it's more like a sphere. This is actually a graph somebody made out of Wikipedia, of the main topics and then how they connect to each other and how the interlinks are. So this is not a content tree. And there's not, it's not a matter of having leaves in here, it's more sort of like reuse of the same stuff over and over again. And you actually want to avoid all of them looking the same, because apparently this is a bad idea to have too many of the same. But you do want to be able to use and multiply the same thing and use it in various settings. So if we're talking about, without ignoring the weaknesses implementing Magnolia, two main issues is that it's page-based and it takes a lot of clicks to actually publish something. What I mean by page-based is this is, of course, the basic interface. You have the page, you have the paragraphs on the page. By the way, I think the terminology of paragraphs is slowly starting to fade away, which is great because the first presentation we had, we were talking about paragraphs, and Pascal was talking about paragraphs and how paragraphs are in the page, and our designer was going, yes, of course the paragraphs are in the page because you start them with a P tag. And no, not that kind of paragraphs, they're different paragraphs. But anyway, these components are on the page, and of course you edit these components through these dialogues. And then modeling stuff in Magnolia, this is the one, I've taken this directly from the documentation on the site. This schema of things always makes me feel really stupid, like I shouldn't really be in content management because I don't really get how this fits together and how this fits together with the actual system. I've looked at it many times, and I still really don't understand what this has to do with the content management and modeling the content. But again, that's probably just my fault, so if people would be so kind to explain me after this, then I would be very grateful. In the meantime, the way I like to think of content management, ideally if it would just be a very abstract system, I would start from a content model. I would then just have the content, and the content model defines the structure of the content. You combine these and you end up with very specific content items. Then as soon as you want to use these content items, you just add a specific format or a template which is going to structure it into HTML or whatever output format you want. And that's what creates a specific type of presentation. And of course, instead of stars, you could use hearts or flowers or whatever, and then you get different presentations of the same content, which is modeled according to the same content. Apparently, in a lot of discussions I've had with Magnolia and also with Aperto, this is not entirely the way that Magnolia is thinking about this. But again, this is one of those ongoing discussions, and if people would like to discuss with me what the difference is between this and explain it to me, I'd be very happy. In the meantime, the upshot is basically that Magnolia is great for creating pages. And it's very nice to create these beautiful pages. Of course, it would be something like this. And you wouldn't be collaborating on this because it's one page, so that's not a good idea. And you probably would have like this green thing there, and you would be able to edit this teaser. That's quite different from the reality of a large media site with a huge amount of articles being published by 100 editorial staff. Basically, what we need is an article publishing machine. We have to keep rolling out articles, and they have to just be published and published and published and published. So, if you compare that again to having a website tree with pages which you then edit, etc., that doesn't really match that. But of course, it's open source, it's extendable, and if you have a good integrator, you can actually go, okay, so this doesn't really match what we want to do. So why not add custom modules to this. So what we came up with Aperto is what we call the content pool. And actually it has a nice icon of a pool, which I don't know who picked this, but it doesn't make any, you picked it. It doesn't really make any sense either. But so we have this small icon of a pool, because it's a pool of content. And in this content pool we have placeless articles, which is somewhat similar to what the guys were demonstrating earlier in Magnolia 5, where you have these contacts, which are an app within Magnolia. So all of our articles are placeless. They don't have a distinct place in a tree. They're just articles. The way you make them visible in a tree is by associating them to specific areas in a tree. And the problem of having too many clicks, we solve by having a streamlined interface. Again, Magnolia 5, we've only seen it really today, but we needed this last year. So what this looks like in reality is that we have this custom module, which is built in GWT, again, built by Aperto. If anybody has any very specific questions on how this works on a technical level and how this hooks into the JCR, etc., go to Jörg, because he's the one who actually did all of the architecture for this. But the important thing to us is that we now just have articles. You create new articles, and the articles have specific fields. So an article has a title, it has an author, it has a summary, it has an image, it has tags and categories, etc. That's basically all editors do. They create these articles. And instead of having to open multiple dialogues and clicking them away again and doing all of these things in different screens, all of the things they have to do are basically in this one screen. So they don't have to move away from this screen. All of the functions they need are here, and they just have to fill it out, scroll down, and save it and activate it. Then on the pages itself, and this is from our test site, so the content isn't really very relevant. And I have to admit that I am starting to get slightly bored with Opera because it's in all of our test sites. But what we have in the sites are actually sort of the queues that take articles from the content pool, based on, for instance, the categories that these articles have, or on specific keywords. So what you define on a page is this is going to display all the content that has these categories, instead of attaching it literally, etc. The dialog for actually changing these sort of cues therefore has fields like the categories, interest tags, editorial tags, and these are going to define which articles are going to show up in this specific component. The upshot of this is that if you look at the page-based Magnolia, then it's not so much that we have components like these, but it's basically the combination of having in each a printing press. Because each of these components on our pages is now a dynamic list of articles being displayed there. Or to go back to the original page, of course with the preview bar on top of it, we still want to have those very nice pages because it's a media site, and these pages have to look really nice to visitors that come to our website because they expect flashy new stuff about Arab Idol, and they expect to read articles about the last year's winner and how she had a party for her birthday. So it has to look very nice and flashy. But in the meantime, we just want those article publishing machines rolling and keeping that kind of content going. In the end, what this looks like in reality is this is the actual homepage we currently have, minus the slider which is above this and the logos that are above this. And even though this is in Arabic, I think this will make some sense after my explanation behind it. The component you see in the bottom here to the right is what we call the content stream, which we were able to develop on top of our implementation. And these are tabs that actually have things like news and sports, and they aggregate news and sports and entertainment from everywhere in our website. So whenever there's a microsite that is talking about sports and has an article about sports, it's also going to show up in one of these tabbed items on this page. And all of this keeps updating at a regular interval. At the same time, in this page, there's a couple of components which an editor will actually manually say, okay, this is so important, I want to highlight something here. The slider that is above this will actually be edited by an editor who is going to say, I will put this picture here, and this needs to be a promotion for the next week. So it's a huge blend of both regular Magnolia, which is quite page-based, combined with our custom development, which is the placeless content which flows through the whole site in all of these different streams. And to wrap this up, actually, I would then go back to the old slogan of Magnolia, which is actually nice and straightforward, and simple is beautiful sounds great, and to an extent it is, and I can understand why they've changed it, because if we think of Magnolia as sort of this great Swiss engineering and this nice Swiss watch, the nice thing also is that it's some kind of watch where you can actually see the insides and you can make modifications and you have can have the customization. And that's it for me for now. So anybody have any questions on this?
Thank you. You said you had two, I'm not sure if you had two software vendors and two implementers, or was it you decide for Magnolia and let them bid together?
We actually started out with 8 combinations of vendors and integrators, which is already very telling because 2 of these showed up without an integrator and then tried to tell us, no, there's a bunch of companies that can do this for us and can work with you. They just somehow couldn't make it to this meeting or the next one or the one after. So we ended up with 2 combinations. So we had one CMS and integrator and another CMS and integrator.
Okay, thank you.
You mentioned you have about 100 editors distributed along the different countries. Mm-hmm. How many articles do they publish on average day?
That's a very good question, and high up on our wish list for new features is better reporting on how much they're actually publishing. So if you could build this for us, then I'd be very happy.
Did you have any performance problems with your dynamic articles, or did you have to implement some sort of caching on that articles?
On the scale we're running this, we of course have a lot of performance issues. It was from the beginning, I think, better than the previous system we had, but we have to invest a lot of time and effort in scaling this. Of course, a nice thing about a site on this scale, both geographically and in the amount of visitors we get, is this is an ongoing thing. So we're constantly working on scaling and the exact way that the caching is fitting into this. And it's actually one of the things that tomorrow, again, we're going to have a large discussion on how to improve these things. The most important thing, I think, so far has been for us that we'd always have this scaling problem with any kind of system. But we're now working with people who actually understand the problems, come up with different solutions, and are working with us to solve this, which is, I think, the key thing.
I find it very interesting that you're having the same problem as others have. As soon as you start with a bunch of information and try to put it into a tree, it works. And after a while, if you have hundreds and thousands of entities, then you start to think of a new concept to access this information with tags or buzzwords or whatever to find the right subset of information which fits to your actual current environment where you are. So it's almost the same as we see in the document management systems. They also go away from the tree as a concept for organization of the information entities. So
I think in general there's still a huge tendency to think of a website as being pages, and as soon as you start trying to create a mobile application from this, you really run into this problem. But a site like Wikipedia is not a tree, because that's not a it's not a natural form for electronic information to be in a tree. And it's sort of like the closest thing people could come up with from a book, which is perfectly linear, is we're going to go one dimension deeper and create trees. and very quickly you run into problems there. And I think one of the best things to do with in Magnolia is to solve that problem as well. If you want to move it beyond sites that are just a few dozen or a few hundred pages, you have to find new ways of organizing this. Okay, thank you.